The air grew thick, swirling with a heavy tension that pressed down on the village as the storm approached. The sky, once clear, was now darkened, and clouds churned with unnatural speed. In the distance, a low rumble of thunder reverberated through the earth, as if it too could feel the impending power that loomed above. The trees around the village groaned and swayed under the growing weight of the wind, their branches reaching toward the heavens in a silent plea for mercy. In the midst of it all stood Ngozi, alone and resolute. Her fingers clutched the ceremonial, knife passed down through generations, its blade gleaming in the dimming light. She held it steady, her heart pounding as a thunderous rumble split the silence, shaking the very ground beneath her. The weight of the decision she had made pressed heavily upon her, and though she knew the ritual was the only way to save her village, doubt gnawed at her spirit. The air around her thickened, heavy with a charge she could almost feel on her skin. As the first drop of rain fell, she remembered her grandmother's words. "The spirits are not merciful, Ngozi. They come with the rain. When they come, you must be ready." But no part of her felt ready. The spirits she had heard of in whispered tales, the ones that would descend from the heavens, were as dangerous as they were ancient. The rain began to fall in steady sheets, beating against her skin like a drum calling her to action. She could hear the distant rhythm of drums echoing from the heart of the village, rising with the wind, signaling that the time had come. The tension in the air grew heavier, the wind howling as if warning her to stop. But she could not. She had made her choice. With one final glance at the knife in her hand, Ngozi stepped forward, her legs heavy but determined. The storm seemed to reach its peak, the winds now wild, the air thick with the power of what was thus about to unfold. She had prepared for this moment for as long as she could remember, but now that it was here, it felt as though the very earth was holding its breath. She raised the knife high above her head, its blade catching what little light remained in the sky. Her voice, though shaking, was clear as she spoke the ancient words of the ritual. The words were ancient, their meaning known only to the chosen diviners, passed down through bloodlines like the knife in her hand. The winds responded, whipping around her, with such force that her hair and clothes were torn by the tempest. And then, with a crack of thunder, it happened. The world seemed to close in around her. The storm's roar grew louder, the earth trembled beneath her feet, and the air grew thick with an unseen presence. From the center of the storm, a figure materialized. It was tall, its form dark and shifting, neither fully human nor spirit. Its eyes burned with an unnatural fire, glowing brightly in the center of the storm. The winds howled as it stepped closer, its form twisting unnaturally with each movement. It spoke, its voice like thunder, deep and resounding, shaking the very air. "You dare summon us, child of the living? What is it you seek? What is it you want from us?" Ngozi stood firm, the knife still raised. Her heart raced, but she did not falter. "I seek the restoration of balance. The rains are destroying us. The spirits are angry, and our people suffer. Help us, and we will offer our respect and devotion." The spirit's eyes narrowed, its lips curling into a grin, sharp teeth glinting. "You think we are interested in your devotion? You think we can be appeased by simple offerings?" The air grew colder, the storm's fury escalating in response to the spirit's challenge. The rain pelted down harder, the wind screaming, as the figure moved toward her, its presence overwhelming. The earth seemed to groan beneath its weight, and Ngozi felt a chill race through her bones. There was no turning back now. Raised under the shadow of a powerful lineage, Ngozi had always been surrounded by the weight of her ancestors' traditions. Her family, revered diviners, had served as the spiritual compass of the village for generations. Rituals, prayers, and sacred ceremonies were woven into the very fabric of her life. She had seen her grandmother, the village's spiritual leader, speak to the spirits as effortlessly as breathing, commanding respect with every word she uttered. Yet, despite this legacy, Ngozi had always resisted the pull of her heritage. "I am not like them," she often told herself. "I will live my own life, free from these chains." But that freedom was never truly hers. No matter how far she tried to run from the path set before her, it always circled back. And when her grandmother passed, the quiet of the village grew heavy with unspoken expectations. The old woman's death had thrown the delicate balance of the village into chaos. Her passing wasn't just the loss of a matriarch. It had shifted the spiritual equilibrium of the entire village. Strange things began to happen. Crops that should have thrived with the rains withered away, their roots dying in the parched earth. Livestock, once strong and healthy, grew sick and weak. Illness spread like a shadow, creeping into every home. The villagers whispered of the spirits' anger, their displeasure at the loss of their conduit to the mortal world. "Perhaps it is time for you to step forward," an elder had suggested, his voice filled with the weight of a request he knew she could not refuse. But Ngozi had only turned away, rejecting the notion outright. She wasn't ready, nor did she believe, in the old ways, as the village did. Her grandmother had always told her the spirits were not merciful, but she had never truly believed in their power, not until now. As the days grew darker, the village's murmurs shifted from fear to desperation. Whispers of the spirit's wrath filled the air, and the village elders, once the keepers of tradition, were at a loss. Their pleas for the rains to return, for the crops to be saved, fell on deaf ears. The villagers turned to Ngozi as they had turned to her grandmother before. Her family, her bloodline, carried with it the power to commune with spirits. The pressure weighed on her like a stone, and though she resisted, the elder's gaze never wavered. He and the others knew. Ngozi was the only one who could perform the Rainstorm ritual. "You must call the spirits, Ngozi," they urged, their voices trembling with both fear and hope. "The village depends on you." It was a ritual that could either save the village or destroy it. The Rainstorm ritual was ancient, steeped in power, but its cost was not always clear. Only those with the truest connection to the spirit world could invoke it. And in her heart, Ngozi knew that connection was a thread she did not believe she could hold. But the weight of the village's hopes, combined with the desperate urgency, drove her forward. "If you do this," one elder had warned, "you may never be able to undo it. The spirits are not easily appeased. The very air in the village seemed to hold its breath. It was not just a ceremony. It was a chance for salvation, or the beginning of destruction." Still, Ngozi hesitated. Despite the family she was born into, despite the whispers and demands, she had never asked for this. But when the first signs of the storm began to take shape on the horizon, when the wind began to stir with unnatural intensity, she knew there was no turning back. The village was no longer just in need of a diviner. It needed her to perform the ritual. Her hand trembled as she picked up the ceremonial knife, an ancient tool passed down through generations. She could feel the weight of the blade, as though it carried the spirits of her ancestors, both present and past. This knife had once been held by her grandmother, the revered matriarch who had tamed the spirits with ease. Could she do the same? With a deep breath, she made her decision, even as doubt gnawed at her. The ritual was not a choice. It was a command, an unspoken law that had been handed down. She would not let the village perish, even if the path before her was uncertain. The rain began to fall in heavy, unrelenting sheets, the storm's power now undeniable. It was the spirit's call, and she would answer. The storm roared overhead, growing wilder with each passing moment. The air crackled with electricity, thick with the pressure of what was to come. Ngozi could feel it in her bones. The weight of destiny. The ritual had been passed down through generations, and now it was her turn to perform it. The entire village, her family's legacy, rested on her shoulders. Failure wasn't an option. If she faltered, the village would suffer. Her grip tightened on the ceremonial knife, its ancient blade shining in the fading light. The storm's fury mirrored the turmoil inside her. She had chosen this path, but as the winds howled louder, doubt gnawed at her. What if the spirits weren't listening? What if she had misjudged everything? On the outskirts of the village, the elders and villagers gathered, eyes wide with fear and anticipation. They could only watch, breath held, as the storm threatened to tear the earth apart. The village was hanging on the edge of survival, and they had placed their hopes on her. It wasn't just about rain. It was about life, about their futures, about the balance of their very existence. They watched as the earth trembled beneath their feet, praying silently for her success. From behind, a voice broke through the rising wind. "You don't know what you're calling, Ngozi." It was Namdi, the chief's son, rushing toward her, with wide eyes, his face ashen with dread. "These spirits are not like the ones your grandmother spoke of. They are ancient, dangerous. You can't control them. If you call them, you may never be able to send them back. You think you can command us, mortal? You are nothing." The spirit's grip grew colder, sending icy tendrils of fear through her body. The winds howled like wolves around her, and she fought with everything inside her. Her arms flailed, her feet scraping against the ground, but the spirit's hold was unbreakable. Every movement felt like a futile attempt, every breath a struggle. Her mind raced. There had to be a way to fight back, to survive this nightmare. But the spirit's power was overwhelming. It laughed darkly, its fiery gaze never leaving her face. "Your strength is nothing. Your words mean nothing. You have nothing!" Desperation surged through Ngozi. She couldn't let the village's last hope end here. With every ounce of energy she had left, she managed to raise the ceremonial knife in her trembling hand. The blade gleamed, catching the faint light of the storm. She forced her arm forward, cutting through the air, and the spirit faltered, its grip loosening just enough for her to break free. She fell to the ground, gasping for air, the pain of her strained muscles coursing through her body. But the relief was brief. The storm had not stopped, and the spirit's presence was still overwhelming, its power far from exhausted. With renewed determination, Ngozi pushed herself up, her voice shaking but defiant. "I am the chosen diviner of this village. You will not destroy us." The words echoed in the storm, defiant and loud, cutting through the roar of the winds. The spirit paused, its form twisting in mid-air, as if considering her. The silence that followed was thick, hanging heavy in the air like a storm cloud before the downpour. For a moment the world stood still, and even the storm seemed to quiet. Then the spirit's laughter shattered the stillness. It echoed like thunder, deep and unsettling, filling the air with dread. "You think this is over, mortal? You think your defiance will save you?" The spirit's voice was dark and foreboding, the promise of more to come, lingering in its words. "This is only the beginning. The true power has yet to reveal itself." The winds picked up again, fiercer than before, as the storm raged on with renewed fury. The air thickened, crackling with the spirit's malevolent energy. The struggle was far from over, and Ngozi knew the real battle had just begun. The storm subsided as suddenly as it had begun. The winds ceased their furious howl, and the earth stilled. Silence enveloped the village, a chilling stillness that contrasted sharply with the violence that had just unfolded. The air, thick with tension, moments before, was now unnaturally calm, as if even the heavens themselves had stopped to watch what had transpired. Ngozi stood at the center of it all, bruised and battered, her clothes torn, and her body aching. Her fingers gripped the ceremonial knife, its blade still gleaming with the weight of her decision. The power she had invoked had not brought the salvation she had hoped for. The ground beneath her feet was still trembling, the echoes of the storm's wrath lingering in the heavy air. She could hear the faint murmur of the villagers behind her, their voices a mixture of fear and awe, as they slowly gathered around her. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with uncertainty. They had seen the power of the spirits firsthand, but what had it accomplished? The crops remained withered, the livestock still sick, and the village lay in ruin. The storm had not restored balance. It had torn apart everything in its path. She looked out across the village, feeling the weight of the truth settle heavily on her shoulders. The spirits, those ancient forces she had sought to appease, had not answered as expected. The ritual had not worked. The damage was done, and no amount of devotion or sacrifice could undo the harm that had been caused. Despite the ritual, the land had not been restored. The earth remained barren, the air thick with despair. The villagers had placed their hopes on the spirits, but now they stood in the midst of their failures, unable to grasp the full extent of the problem. There were no simple answers, no magical solution that would bring the village back to life. Ngozi's heart sank as she realized the harsh truth. The spirits were not the solution. They were not the ones who could heal the land. The problems facing the village were far deeper, rooted in neglect, fear, and a refusal to adapt to the changing world around them. She had believed in the power of the ritual, but the storm had shown her that the spirits could not save them. It was up to the people of the village to save themselves. As the villagers gathered closer, some with tears in their eyes, others with looks of fear and regret, Ngozi felt the full weight of responsibility pressing down on her. The burden was hers, and she could not escape it. The fate of the village no longer rested on the spirits. It rested on her, on the choices she would make, and the actions she would take. She turned to face them, the knife still held tightly in her hand. The realization hit her like a wave. Healing would not come from appeasing ancient forces, but from confronting the truth and taking responsibility for the land, for their future. The village had to face the consequences of their actions and rebuild from within. The spirits had given no answers, but now it was clear. Their power was not the answer. With a steady breath, she spoke, her voice clear and strong. We must rebuild, but we cannot rely on rituals alone. It is in our hands to restore what has been lost. Together we can heal the land, but it will take more than offerings to the spirits. It will take our strength, our unity, and our will to change. The villagers fell silent, the weight of her words settling over them. Some looked at her with doubt, others with a flicker of hope. But all knew she was right. The time for waiting was over. It was time for action. Ngozi's role was no longer that of a servant to the spirits. It was that of a leader, someone who would guide the village not through appeasing the unknown, but through action and responsibility. She would lead them toward a future built on their own efforts, on their own will to change, and on their collective strength. As the villagers began to stir, a new sense of purpose filled the air. The silence that had once been heavy with fear now carried the promise of renewal. They were not alone. They would rebuild, not as servants of ancient forces, but as masters of their own fate. The realization hit Ngozi like a flood. The village's suffering had never been about the spirits. It was the people who had caused it. For too long, they had clung to outdated rituals, believing that appeasing invisible forces would somehow restore their fortunes. But the rituals had failed them. The storm, the destruction, the hunger. It was all because of their refusal to change, to adapt to the world around them. The spirits were not the cause of their suffering. Their suffering was self-inflicted, a consequence of their blind reliance on the past, on traditions that no longer held power over a world that had moved on. The villagers had placed their faith in forces they couldn't control, their eyes closed to the realities of their own choices. Now, standing in the wreckage, Ngozi understood the harsh truth. She could no longer follow the path laid by her ancestors. The rituals, the ceremonies, they were not the solution. The true power lay in balance, not in appeasing the spirits, but in restoring harmony within themselves and with the world around them. The land was not sick because the spirits were angry. The land was sick because the people had neglected it, because they had failed to see that change was not only inevitable, but necessary. Her heart ached as she looked at the villagers who still clung to the old ways. Their faces were filled with fear, their eyes searching for something, anything, that would bring relief. But they were looking in the wrong direction. The relief they sought was not to be found in rituals or offerings. It was to be found in their own hands, in their ability to work together, to rebuild from the ground up. As the rains began to fall again, this time gentle and steady, a sense of peace washed over Ngozi. The storm had passed, the winds had died down, but something else had shifted inside her. Her role, once so clear and defined by her family's legacy, had changed. She was no longer the servant of spirits, the one who would call upon them to intervene. She was a leader, someone who would guide her people forward, not by appeasing ancient forces, but by teaching them to live in harmony with the world they had forgotten. With the rain, a weight lifted from her heart. The storm clouds parted, not just in the sky, but in her mind as well. Clarity, once elusive, was now hers. The truth was simple. The village's future lay in their hands, not in the power of spirits. The past had shown them that, and now they had to face the future. No more rituals, no more waiting for the impossible. It was time for action. Ngozi turned to the villagers, her voice steady and strong. We cannot wait for the spirits to save us. We must save ourselves. We must rebuild, not with offerings to the unseen, but with our own effort, our own hands. It is time to stop relying on what has failed us. It is time to look to each other and to the land. Her words, though simple, were powerful. The villagers looked at her, some with doubt, others with hope, but all with the understanding that they could no longer rely on the past to save them. They must take the first steps toward change. The land, which had been their source of life, would once again become their partner. They would restore the balance, not by appeasing spirits, but by respecting nature and working together. Ngozi's new path had begun, not as a servant to the spirits, but as a leader who would help her people find strength in themselves and in the unity they shared. The village, free from the grip of ancient rituals, would begin to rebuild, guided by their own hands and hearts. The power to restore balance lay within them, and Ngozi would lead them toward a future built on responsibility and self-reliance. The storms of the past were over. The rains of renewal had come, and with them, a new beginning.